One night in 1859, the world looked up and thought the sun was gone. Colors rippled through the darkness: red, green, violet, so bright that people could read their letters at midnight. Telegraph wires sparked with fire. Compasses spun like they'd lost their minds. And for a few silent hours, the earth glowed as if it had fallen into another sky. Good evening, my friend. Before we drift into this forgotten night of fire and silence, take a moment, tap like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, what would you do if the sun suddenly disappeared? Now close your eyes. Let's return to the year 1859, to the night when the sky itself lost control. The summer of 1859 drifted toward its end in a calm and golden haze. Across England, the fields shimmered under a steady sun, and the air held that faint metallic stillness that always comes before autumn. Steam trains sighed along distant rails, and the scent of coal smoke lingered above small towns. Telegraph lines stretched like taut spider silk across the countryside, new symbols of progress and human confidence. It was a time when people believed the world had finally begun to make sense, when even the mysteries of the heavens seemed ready to yield to careful study. And in one quiet corner of Surrey, a man named Richard Carrington spent his mornings watching the sun. Carrington was not a showman or a public thinker. He was, in the best English sense of the word, an observer, a quiet, methodical student of patterns. He rose each morning before the mist had lifted, crossed his garden still damp with dew, and entered the small round observatory he had built with his own hands. Inside it smelled faintly of oil, brass, and paper. The telescope, a polished instrument of precision, pointed steadily toward the eastern sky. Each day he traced the movement of the dark, shifting marks upon the sun's surface, sunspots, as they were called, mysterious stains upon perfection. He drew them carefully, with a draftsman's discipline and a scholar's patience. Every stroke of his pencil was deliberate. Every line had meaning. For years he had filled page after page with these drawings. Some spots appeared and vanished within hours. Others lingered for days, spreading and curling like storms upon an ocean. Carrington noted their changes, their drift across the solar disk, their reappearance with the turning of weeks. He did not think of them as living things, but he knew they pulsed with energy. He once wrote that the sun is not so still as it appears, but a world of motion and fire with a life of its own. That Thursday morning, September 1st, began no differently than any other. The light was sharp, the air dry, the day unremarkable in every sense. At 11 o'clock, he sat before his telescope and adjusted the smoke glass filter that allowed him to stare into the heart of the sun without blinding himself. He traced the edge of a familiar dark cluster near the center of the disk, his pencil moving with quiet assurance. And then, without warning, the calm broke. He saw it first as a shimmer, a flash too quick for thought. Then two spots of blinding whiteness burst out from within the darkness of the largest cluster. For an instant, he thought his eyes had betrayed him. The brightness was unnatural, painful, even through the filter. But it did not vanish. Instead, the light swelled, connecting the two spots with a bridge of fire that rippled across the face of the sun. It grew until the entire region glowed with a radiance that seemed to tremble through the telescope itself. Carrington stepped back instinctively, blinking, the afterimage burning in his vision. He checked the clock. It was precisely 18 minutes past 11 that the light continued for nearly 5 minutes. He stood motionless, torn between wonder and unease. The sun had never done this before. It was as if something inside it had opened, a wound or a heartbeat. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the brilliance collapsed. The two bright spots shrank and vanished, leaving only the calm, speckled surface behind. The silence of the observatory felt deeper than before, as if the air itself had paused to listen. Carrington wrote a single line in his notebook. Two patches of intensely bright light broke out within the group. lasted 5 minutes, suddenly disappeared. Then he sat very still, his hands folded on the desk. He knew he had seen something extraordinary, but he could not name it. There were no words yet for what had happened. The term solar flare would not exist for decades. To him, it was simply an event, a transient brightness, a curiosity to be recorded. Yet as he stared at the page, he felt a small uneasiness settle behind his calm professionalism. The air outside seemed strangely charged, and even the sunlight through the window carried a faint, unnatural edge. Later that day, Carrington walked to visit a fellow observer, Richard Hodgson, who lived several miles away. To his surprise, Hodgson had seen the same thing at nearly the same moment. The sudden eruption of light, the 5-minute blaze, the abrupt fading. 2 witnesses, 2 telescopes, 1 event. Carrington felt a flicker of reassurance, confirmation that his eyes had not deceived him. But with that reassurance came a deeper question. What could cause the sun itself to flash like lightning? Neither man had an answer. By afternoon, the unease had faded, replaced by the familiar rhythms of daily life. In London, the factories roared, the markets bustled, and telegraph offices clicked with the sound of progress. No one suspected that far above the blue sky, a storm of unimaginable power was racing toward the Earth. From the surface of the sun, billions of tons of charged gas were hurtling outward at nearly 1,000,000 miles per hour. Invisible, silent, unstoppable, they sped through the black emptiness of space, carrying with them the memory of that flared as evening came. The English countryside slipped into quiet. The first chill of autumn brushed the air. Lamps glowed behind drawn curtains, and smoke rose from chimneys. Carrington closed his observatory dome, checked the clock once more, and wrote his final notes for the day. He did not know that his discovery, his brief 5 minutes of light, was about to ignite the night sky from one end of the world to the other while he slept. The storm arrived. It began as a whisper of color at the northern edge of the sky, faint and far, easily mistaken for dawn. But the glow grew stronger, spreading and deepening until the heavens themselves seemed to burn. In the wilderness of Canada, hunters stopped and stared as curtains of green and red light rippled from horizon to horizon. In New York, men leaving taverns pointed upward and fell silent. In Havana, sailors ran to the decks of their ships, shouting that the clouds were on fire. Across half the globe, the night became day. The auroras had come before, but never like this. They stretched far beyond their usual home near the poles, descending over continents that had never seen such things. The lights pulsed and shifted, painting the world in restless motion. Witnesses wrote that the sky looked alive, as if breathing. Horses bolted, dogs howled, and people knelt in the streets, uncertain whether they were seeing a miracle or an ending. In America, the glow was so bright that newspapers could be read outdoors at midnight. Miners in the Rocky Mountains rose for work hours too early, believing the sun had already risen. And in the cities, where telegraph lines webbed across rooftops and alleys, something stranger still occurred. The wires began to hum. Sparks leapt from metal. Operators cried out as electric shocks ran through their hands. Batteries burst into flame. In several offices, telegraph paper ignited as fiery threads danced across the instruments. Yet when they cut the power, the signals did not stop. Messages continued to flow through disconnected lines, powered by nothing but the charged air. The Earth itself had become a conductor. From Boston to Paris, bewildered engineers recorded the phenomenon. Some called it the work of lightning. Others suspected invisible magnetism. A few simply refused to believe what they saw. In the following days, reports poured in. Fires in telegraph rooms, needles on compasses spinning wildly, strange metallic tastes in the air. No one could explain it, and somewhere in Surrey, Richard Carrington awoke to a world quietly astonished. The morning light seemed softer, filtered through a pale haze. He dressed quickly and returned to his telescope. What he saw filled him with both satisfaction and dread. The dark patches he had sketched the day before were larger, twisted, and scarred by new ones forming around them. The region of the flare was still unstable, trembling with unseen power. He knew then that the event he had witnessed had not ended. It had merely begun. That he made his observations in silence. Outside, the world buzzed with rumors. Newspapers carried breathless accounts of the night of fire, of skies that glowed red as blood and wires that carried messages from ghosts. Some feared divine punishment. Others spoke of new kinds of lightning. Only Carrington and a handful of scientists suspected that the answer lay beyond Earth. But even he could not imagine the scale of what had happened. The sun, that comforting disk of gold above the fields, had hurled a storm across space strong enough to make the planet tremble. For days afterward, the auroras lingered. On some nights, they flared so intensely that ships at sea navigated by their light. Farmers stayed awake just to watch the heavens shimmer. Children remembered it for the rest of their lives. When the glow finally faded, the world felt quieter, smaller, as though it had glimpsed a truth it could not keep. Carrington's discovery was soon published. His calm description, those few careful lines written at 11:18 in the morning, became the foundation of a new science. Decades later, as physics uncovered the secrets of electromagnetism and space weather, his name would return. The Carrington Event, the greatest solar storm in recorded history. Every modern flare, every disturbance in the magnetic field, every satellite warning still echoes that day. But in his own lifetime, Carrington remained a modest figure, living quietly among his instruments. He knew he had witnessed something immense, but he also knew that understanding would come slowly. Science moves at the pace of patience. Night came early that September. The world did not know it yet, but the Earth was already inside the storm. From the edges of space, a river of charged particles, a tide of invisible fire, had reached the atmosphere. And as darkness fell, the heavens began to glow. At first it was faint, just a smear of light at the northern horizon, no brighter than moonlit clouds. In the rural silence of Canada, trappers paused and stared. The glow did not fade. It spread and deepened, climbing upward until the entire sky turned a shade of ghostly green. Then came the movement, curtains of color, rippling as if stirred by an unseen wind, folding and unfolding like silk in slow motion. They twisted and flared, and at their edges ran streaks of red and violet so vivid that men dropped their lanterns in disbelief. The northern lights had come, but they had come too far, too bright, too soon. The year was 1859, and most people had never seen such a thing. The aurora was a mystery of the poles, spoken of by sailors and explorers, a rumor carried from frozen seas. But now, it descended upon the towns and cities of the world like a silent invasion. Across the forests of Canada, miners and hunters watched the heavens blaze. In Maine and Vermont, families stepped out of their houses in the middle of the night, thinking the sunrise had arrived early. In New York, the light reflected off the windows of tenement buildings and shimmered in the dark water of the Hudson. Witnesses described the sky as a living thing. The lights did not stand still. They moved and breathed. Waves of crimson pulsed upward like smoke from invisible flames. Bands of emerald light arched across the sky and vanished into violet mist. Some said it felt as though the heavens were falling toward them, as if the world were surrounded by fire but not burning. One man in Ohio wrote that the sky appeared to be covered with a blood-red canopy, from which shot rays of light, as though from a mighty conflagration. In the Caribbean, sailors on deck of merchant ships stared northward and saw the same fire glowing beyond the horizon. They thought cities must be burning on distant shores. In Cuba, a newspaper reported that the entire northern sky was a curtain of light, wavering and trembling like a flag in the wind. The air was still, and yet it shimmered. The colors faded only to return stronger, brighter, spreading until the stars themselves were drowned in their glow. And no one had words for what was happening. Priests spoke of omens. Farmers called their neighbors to look. Children woke crying, saying the world had turned upside down. For many, it was the first and only time they would see the aurora, and it was so bright, so strange, that even the most skeptical were struck speechless in North America. It was barely past midnight when the first reports of trouble began to reach the telegraph offices. The operators were used to storms and interference, but this was something else entirely. Wires hummed without power. Instruments hissed and sparked. In Boston, a telegraph key caught fire, sending the clerks scrambling for water. In Montreal, a blue glow lit the walls of the office like a ghostly flame. The men at the lines were professionals, not prone to superstition. They had spent years tapping messages across thousands of miles of copper wire, confident in their mastery of the new art of electricity. Yet that night, the machines they trusted turned against them. Some described shocks that jumped from the metal keys to their fingers. Others saw their paper tapes burst into flame. When they tried to disconnect the batteries, the current did not stop. The messages kept coming. It was as though the air itself had become electric. One operator in Philadelphia wrote later. We were able to carry on conversation for nearly 2 hours without any batteries at all. The aurora itself supplied the current. Never before or since have I seen such a thing. Across the continent, astonished telegraphers exchanged notes on what they were witnessing, a world where energy flowed not from human invention, but from the sky itself. Meanwhile, in London, word of the spectacle spread through the streets. The British press had always loved celestial events. Comets, eclipses, and meteors filled their pages with wonder. But this was beyond wonder. Over the North Sea, the sky burned red as dawn, though the clocks said midnight. In the Scottish Highlands, shepherds kept watch with their flocks beneath a canopy of rippling light that made the grass shimmer like water. On the coasts, sailors mistook the glow for distant storms, only to find it silent and still. For many, it was terrifying. There were whispers that the sun itself had cracked, that the world was ending, that heaven was on fire. In an age before electric light, the sight of the sky ablaze felt unnatural, overwhelming. People prayed. Some celebrated. Others simply stood and stared, too astonished to move. And yet, amid the awe and confusion, there was a strange beauty, a calm beneath the chaos. The aurora moved in slow waves, graceful and deliberate. It seemed to dance without rhythm, yet with purpose, as if some vast, unseen force were painting the heavens stroke by stroke. The silence of it was almost unbearable. You could hear the rustle of leaves, the distant sound of a dog barking, the faint hum of wires trembling above the fields, but the light itself made no sound. It was the soundless voice of the sun, speaking across space in those hours. The Earth's magnetic field bent and twisted under the weight of the storm. Invisible lines of force rippled through the atmosphere, pulling at compass needles, disturbing currents deep underground. The planet itself seemed to shiver. The aurora reached as far south as Rome, Madrid, and even Honolulu. There are stories, hard to confirm, but impossible to forget, of the glow reflecting off the snow of the Andes, and of faint ripples seen near the equator. The entire world, it seemed, was inside the storm's breath in the small hours before dawn. Somewhere in England, Richard Carrington awoke. He had gone to bed early, unaware that the flare he had recorded had already transformed the night. When he stepped outside, the air smelled of iron. The sky above his garden was pale and trembling. He could not believe what he saw. The same strange colors he had once glimpsed in drawings from Arctic explorers now flowing above his own roof. He watched them for a long time, his face lit by the slow pulse of red and green light. Somewhere in that shifting glow, he knew, was the echo of the flash he had seen through his telescope. The sun was still speaking, and the earth was answering. Carrington was not a man easily given to emotion, but in that moment, he felt the weight of what he had witnessed. He understood, if only dimly, that this was no ordinary night. The world had been touched by the same force that powered the stars. The thought was terrifying, but also humbling. It reminded him how small the earth was, how delicate its balance. For all the progress of man, the machines, the telegraphs, the proud science of electricity, they were still children playing at the edge of a fire they could not control. In America, the aurora reached its peak around 2 in the morning. In cities and farms, in harbors and open plains, people stood outside watching the sky. There are stories of farmers in Kansas hitching their wagons by the false light, believing it was dawn. Miners in the mountains began their shifts hours too early. Sailors at sea changed course, mistaking the glow for sunrise. For a few strange hours, time itself lost meaning. The night and the day had blurred together. Then, slowly, the fire began to fade. The colors weakened, the motion slowed. By the first true dawn, the sky was pale and empty once again. But something had changed. Across the world, instruments recorded disturbances in the magnetic field for days afterward. Compasses refused to hold steady. The telegraph operators, exhausted and shaken, cleaned the scorch marks from their tables. Newspapers rushed to print stories of the night the sky caught fire, describing scenes so surreal that readers doubted their truth. And in the quiet that followed, a strange melancholy settled over the world. The storm had not destroyed anything lasting. The wires would be repaired, the instruments replaced. But something deeper had shifted, a realization that the universe was not as still as it appeared. The sun, that constant companion in the sky, was not a serene guardian, but a restless, living thing. Its calm face hid tempests greater than anything on Earth. Humanity had glimpsed, for one night, the raw pulse of the cosmos in the weeks that followed. Carrington and other astronomers struggled to understand what had happened. They spoke of magnetic forces, of solar activity, of some mysterious connection between the sun and the earth, but they lacked the tools to prove it. To most, the event remained a beautiful mystery, a story for poets and dreamers. Yet to a few, the careful observers, the quiet thinkers, it was a warning. Carrington kept his drawings safe, along with the note he had written that morning. He corresponded with Hodgson, compared times, measurements, observations. They both knew that what they had seen through their telescopes and what the world had seen that night were pieces of the same puzzle. It was humbling to think that a brief flash of light on the sun could ignite the skies of Earth, that a moment's energy could travel across space and change the night itself. Years later, as technology advanced, the connection would become clear. Scientists would learn that the sun's eruptions, solar flares, and coronal mass ejections can send waves of charged particles toward Earth, distorting its magnetic field and lighting its skies with auroras. When the storm reached its greatest strength, the Earth's skin, that delicate web of magnetic fields, twisted in ways no one had imagined. The change was invisible, but its effects rippled through everything that carried a current. For the first time in history, humanity felt the direct touch of the sun's anger through its own inventions. The telegraph, that proud symbol of progress, became the storm's unwitting canvas. By 1859, the telegraph network was the beating heart of a new, connected world. Wires stretched across continents, thin veins of copper humming with human thought. Messages that once took weeks by ship now arrived in minutes. It was the miracle of its age, the internet of the 19th century, a revolution made of metal and sparks. Every major city, from New York to London, from Paris to Bombay, was tied together by it. The hum of the telegraph keys was the sound of modern life. On the morning of September 2nd, that hum turned into a roar. In the offices of the American Telegraph Company in Boston, operators began their day as usual. The machines clicked and tapped, relaying news and prices, letters and love notes. But then the instruments began to hiss. Blue sparks leapt between metal contacts. A faint smell of ozone filled the room. When one operator reached for the key, he felt a sharp sting, like touching a hot coal. The wire glowed red for a heartbeat, and the paper beneath it began to smoke. Someone shouted to cut the batteries. They did, but the current didn't stop. The machines continued to tap, alive with a power that came from nowhere. Across the Atlantic, in Paris, the same thing was happening. Messages flickered through without any power source. Some wires carried more voltage than a man could safely touch. In Scotland, a telegraph station caught fire. In Philadelphia, the paper rolls ignited as blue arcs danced across the desk. In Washington, D.C., an operator reported that he could still send messages after his equipment had been completely disconnected. The current, he wrote, seemed to come from the air itself. It was as if the Earth had become a single vast battery, charged and alive. The great web of wires that crossed oceans and mountains had turned into a conductor for the storm's invisible hand. And no one understood why. Newspapers called it electrical mania. Some suggested lightning in the upper atmosphere. Others blamed faulty equipment or the alignment of the planets. But for those who sat before the telegraph machines, it was something stranger, something that felt almost alive. The wires sang. They hissed softly like serpents in the walls. Messages appeared unbidden, strings of code without sender or meaning. Some operators swore they heard faint ringing even when the machines were silent, a ghostly echo in the air. Far from the cities, the same strange effects unfolded in lonely outposts and rail stations. In Canada, where the night sky still glowed faintly red, a solitary telegraph worker wrote in his logbook that his instruments were possessed by the northern lights. The aurora was so bright outside his window that he needed no lamp. When he placed his hand near the wire, it buzzed faintly against his palm. The earth itself, it seemed, was speaking through metal. For hours the phenomenon continued. Lines carried phantom signals, batteries overheated, relays hummed on their own. No one could control it. In New York, some offices simply stopped working altogether, fearing fires. In Boston, curious crowds gathered outside the telegraph buildings to watch as smoke drifted from the windows. It was the strangest thing anyone had ever seen. Electricity without source. Machines running on air. And still, above it all, the auroras danced. People wrote that the lights seemed to pulse in rhythm with the activity of the telegraph. When the sky brightened, the instruments grew stronger. When the glow faded, the signals weakened. It was as if the heavens were in conversation with the earth, one vast current flowing through everything alive and inanimate. To those who believed in science, it was proof that the world had entered a new age. To those who studied science, it was proof that they still knew almost nothing. Through that long day, Richard Carrington followed the reports as best he could. Letters from fellow astronomers described magnetic compasses spinning and instruments shaking. At Kew Observatory, just outside London, the magnetometers, devices built to measure the Earth's magnetic field, went wild. The recording pins that usually traced neat lines across the paper began to thrash violently, drawing jagged waves and loops until the mechanism jammed completely. The planet's magnetic field, usually stable, had gone into chaos. Carrington sat in his study, surrounded by the quiet tick of clocks and the faint creak of the wooden floor. On his desk lay the drawing he had made the day before, that moment when the sun had erupted in blinding light. Now he understood that it was connected. The flare he had seen through his telescope and the strange disturbances across the world were parts of the same event. The sun had reached across 93 million miles of space and shaken the Earth like a bell, but the idea was too vast for most to accept. The public loved stories of wonder, but the thought that the sun could directly affect their world, that a storm of light could set wires on fire, seemed impossible. The newspapers instead printed stories about celestial fireworks and mysteries of the sky. Some poets described the auroras as angels. Others called them a curtain between life and eternity. The science of the thing would come slowly, over decades, long after Carrington was gone. In the days that followed, the storm continued to pulse. Each night brought another display of light. The colors shifted, from crimson to emerald, from gold to deep violet. Over Europe, whole cities turned off their gas lamps to watch the heavens blaze. In America, painters tried to capture the impossible shades of light on their canvases, but none could match the memory of the real thing. The aurora was not merely color. It was movement, vibration, life itself written in the sky, and beneath it, humanity continued to marvel and fear. Some saw it as a warning from above, others as a promise of beauty. Farmers spoke of good harvests to come. Sailors whispered of doom at sea. But in the quiet of observatories and libraries, a few minds began to sense the truth that this was not an omen, but a glimpse into a hidden system, a conversation between the Earth and its star. The sun, it seemed, could reach out and touch the world in ways no one had ever known. In the United States, the telegraph companies repaired their lines and returned to work. But many operators could not forget the experience. They spoke of how the machines had come alive, how they had sent messages with no power, how the air itself had hummed like a living thing. In one report, a telegraph superintendent wrote that the aurora communicated intelligence through its own agency. The phrase was poetic, but it captured a truth. The storm had revealed something about the nature of the world, that energy could flow through space, invisible but real. Linking everything together, Carrington's discovery reached the Royal Astronomical Society soon after. His quiet report, only a few pages long, described the bright flash, the timing, and the sudden vanishing of light. There was no exaggeration, no speculation. Yet between the lines was a sense of awe. He had seen something that had never been seen before, and the consequences of that sight were still unfolding. The scientific community received his paper politely, but without full understanding. They would not grasp its true significance until the next century, when physics and astronomy caught up with what his telescope had shown him. By the end of September, the storm's strength began to fade. The auroras retreated toward the poles. The magnetic instruments calmed. The world exhaled. But the traces of what had happened lingered, not just in the physical damage to wires and instruments, but in the imagination of those who had witnessed it. The night sky, once so constant and familiar, had revealed its volatility. The sun, once the symbol of steady life, had shown its temper. And mankind, for all its inventions, had been reminded of its place, small, fragile, luminous only by reflection. For Richard Carrington, life returned to its steady rhythm. Each morning he continued his observations, tracing the quiet dance of sunspots. Yet sometimes, when the light shifted a certain way, he would pause. He could never forget the blinding flare, or the reports of that long, fiery night. He understood now that the sun was not simply a lamp in the sky, but a restless ocean of energy. His telescope had shown him only a glimpse, but that glimpse had changed the way he saw the world forever. Years later, when others would look back and name the event after him, they would remember it as the Carrington Event, the greatest solar storm in recorded history. It would remain unmatched even into the 21st century, a benchmark against which all others would be measured. Yet for Carrington himself, it was not fame that mattered, but wonder. He had looked at the face of the sun and seen it breathe. The legacy of that storm did not end with him. The magnetic disturbances it revealed would lay the foundation for new sciences, for our understanding of solar cycles, for space weather prediction, for the fragile balance between our planet and the star that sustains it. It would teach future generations that beauty and danger often share the same source. And so the world went on. The telegraphs clicked again, the ships sailed, the cities grew brighter with each passing year. But sometimes, on quiet nights, When the aurora dances faintly at the edge of the northern sky, the memory returns. When dawn finally came on September 3rd, the world seemed strangely hesitant to wake. The light that touched the hills and rooftops of the northern hemisphere that morning felt washed and tired, as if it too had endured a sleepless night. In the cities, a fine gray haze hung in the air. It wasn't smoke exactly, nor mist, but something faintly metallic, the leftover breath of a sky that had burned and glowed for hours. People rose from their beds in silence, eyes heavy from wonder and fear. The night of fire had passed, but its echo clung to everything, soft and uneasy. In London, the first trains moved through streets that still carried whispers of the strange light. Milkmen said that the gas lamps had burned pale against the aurora's glow, useless and ghostly. Night watchmen told stories of hearing faint crackles above the telegraph poles, as if the air had been whispering. Now, as sunlight returned, those memories seemed half-dreamed. Newspapers rushed to print the headlines they had prepared before dawn. Extraordinary celestial display, the sky aflame over Europe. At breakfast tables, men in waistcoats unfolded the papers and read aloud to their families while the tea cooled. Some chuckled at the exaggeration, some shook their heads, and others simply stared at the illustrations, their minds replaying what they had seen through their own windows. For one quiet morning, conversation in every shop, every train carriage, every drawing room circled back to the same topic, the night sky. Londoners, used to smog and fog, spoke of seeing the heavens clear and alive, a sight so pure that even the stars had seemed to move. In the countryside, farmers described how their fields had glowed, how the wheat had shimmered as though silver. In Scotland, fishermen arriving with their dawn catch told of sailing under crimson clouds so bright they could see each other's faces. The world had glimpsed something it could not forget, yet beneath the all lay unease. The telegraph offices remained closed in many places that morning. The managers feared more fires. Some wires still carried faint static, an unheard song running through them long after the aurora had faded. In Boston, technicians tested their instruments and found that compasses swung lazily, unable to settle. In Paris, engineers complained that their magnetometers had drawn wild loops across the recording paper all through the night. At Kew Observatory, near London, the needles still trembled slightly, as if some invisible force had not quite let go. Richard Carrington woke early, long before the newspapers reached his door. The air in his small observatory was cool and still. He moved about quietly, checking each instrument as if to reassure himself that the world had returned to order. On his desk lay the drawing he had made 2 days earlier, the precise ink circles marking the location of the flare. It looked ordinary, almost too calm for the event it represented. He stared at it for a long time, remembering the blinding light that had filled his telescope. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the faint rattle of a train, the distant life of a world that had no idea what it had narrowly endured. He turned the telescope toward the sun once more, careful, methodical. Through the smoke glass, he could see that the dark region he had observed before had changed shape again. It was twisted, blurred at the edges, as if still in turmoil. The sun, usually serene, now seemed to pulse faintly, breathing in light. He made a new drawing, steady hands tracing what his eyes recorded, and then he wrote a few measured lines in his notebook. He did not use the words storm, or flare, or eruption. Science had not yet found those terms. He wrote instead, "The disturbance continues." Outside, the day brightened. The people who had spent the night watching the sky now looked up with a kind of suspicion, as though the familiar daylight could not entirely be trusted. In the markets, the talk was not of harvests or politics, but of what it all might mean. Some said the lights foretold great change, a war, a new king, a judgment. Others insisted it was simply nature, a spectacle to be admired. For most, it was both. Beauty and warning woven together. In New York, the harbor bustled under a pale morning sun. Dock workers, who had stopped work to watch the heavens, now labored again. But every few minutes someone would point upward, as if expecting the colors to return. The telegraph offices had opened cautiously. The smell of scorched insulation still hung in the air. On one desk, a piece of burned paper bore the faint traces of a message that had written itself during the storm, random dots and dashes carved by fire. The clerks saved it as a curiosity. The voice of the aurora, one of them called it, across the Atlantic. In Canada, the night had been even brighter. Farmers told of cows wandering from their barns, fooled by the false dawn. Children had played outside long past bedtime, chasing shadows across the glowing fields. Now, as the real sun rose, the world looked oddly ordinary, almost dull compared to what they had seen. The sky seemed too pale, the ground too quiet. A sense of emptiness settled in, the silence that follows astonishment. Carrington spent that afternoon writing to the Royal Astronomical Society. He described his observation with the careful tone of a scientist who knows he has witnessed something rare but cannot yet explain it. He mentioned the exact time, the duration, and the sudden disappearance of the bright patches. He wrote nothing of the auroras or the telegraph fires. Those were matters of rumor, not data. But deep down, he must have sensed that they were linked. The sun, the magnetic field, the strange electric air, they were pieces of the same great puzzle. Elsewhere, others were beginning to draw the same connection. At Kew, the observers compared their magnetograms with Carrington's report and saw that the magnetic disturbance on Earth had begun within hours of his recorded flare. The coincidence was too perfect to ignore. Still, they hesitated to claim it publicly. The idea that the sun could reach across millions of miles to shake the instruments of Earth seemed absurd. The world was not yet ready to accept that its serene star could be violent. In the days that followed, scientists, writers, and philosophers argued about what had happened. Some insisted it was purely atmospheric, a phenomenon of the upper air, unrelated to the sun. Others, more daring, suggested that electricity itself was cosmic, that perhaps the universe was connected by unseen currents. Those ideas would one day become the foundation of modern astrophysics. But in 1859, they sounded like dreams, and so the event began to fade into history almost as soon as it had occurred. The fires were repaired, the instruments cleaned, the skies returned to blue. But for those who had lived through it, something remained unsettled. They had seen the heavens behave like a living creature, unpredictable and wild. It left them both humbled and uneasy. In small towns, people still spoke of it for weeks. Tavern stories grew grander with each retelling. In one version, the lights had spelled out words in the sky. In another, ships at sea had found their compasses pointing not north, but upward. The truth was already turning into legend. But beneath the exaggerations lay a real memory, a night when nature had broken its silence and shown its power without warning. Carrington continued his quiet work. He published his findings modestly, almost apologetically, in a short report that few noticed at first. The world was busy with other things: wars, inventions, politics. Yet the records he kept that year would one day become essential. Future astronomers would read his words and understand that what he had seen was the first recorded solar flare. They would give it his name, the Carrington Event. The following winter was long and gray. The sun seemed calm again, almost too calm. Carrington observed it daily, perhaps wondering whether another outburst would come. It never did, not in his lifetime. But he had changed. The sun was no longer a simple object of study. It was a living force, unpredictable and vast. Every spot he drew, every subtle shift of light, reminded him of the day the sky lost its composure. Across Europe and America, the world settled back into its rhythm. Telegraph traffic resumed, trains ran on time, and factories filled the air with smoke. But in the quiet corners, In observatories, universities, and lonely outposts, people still spoke of the storm. It had revealed something invisible yet undeniable, that the Earth was not separate from the cosmos, but part of it, bound by unseen threads of magnetism and light. For those who had watched the aurora, the memory lingered in colors that no artist could match. In diaries written years later, they described it not just as a vision, but as a feeling, a vibration in the chest, a sense of connection to something enormous. Some wrote that it was beautiful beyond words. Others admitted it had frightened them to their core. But all agreed on one thing. They had seen the sky alive, and when the next generation heard those stories, they found it hard to believe. The world had changed too quickly. Gaslight became electric light. Telegraph became telephone. Horse-drawn carriages became trains that ran on steel and steam. The night sky faded behind the glow of progress. Only in the far north, where the aurora still danced quietly on winter nights, did people remember what had once stretched across the entire world. Sometimes, when Carrington looked at his telescope, he must have wondered what it would mean if such a storm happened again, in a world so much more dependent on wires, on energy, on light. He could not have imagined satellites or computers, but he knew enough to sense that the forces he had glimpsed were beyond human control. In the quiet days that followed the storm, the world tried to convince itself that everything had returned to normal. The skies were blue again, the nights dark once more, the telegraph lines repaired and humming with ordinary messages about trade, crops, and weather. Yet a subtle restlessness lingered in the air, something no one could quite name. Even the most ordinary things, the ticking of a clock, the glint of sunlight on iron rails, seemed to carry a faint memory of the strangeness that had passed. For the people who worked closest to the instruments of the age, the surveyors, the navigators, the explorers, it soon became clear that the world's balance was still quietly skewed. The compasses had begun to wander. It started with whispers from the shipping lanes. Captains reported that their magnetic needles no longer pointed true north. Some swung lazily and refused to settle. Others drifted several degrees from their usual headings. In the harbors of Liverpool and Boston, pilots compared their charts and found discrepancies that made no sense. At first, they blamed poor calibration or rust on the fittings. But when entire fleets began reporting the same confusion, attention turned skyward once more. Something invisible was still touching the Earth. By mid-September 1859, the geomagnetic field, the unseen shield that wrapped the planet, was still trembling from the blow it had taken. Its lines of force, normally steady and reliable, had twisted like threads in the wind. Even the smallest compasses, carried by travelers and engineers, felt its disturbance. To the ordinary person, it was nothing, a quiver, a hesitation of a needle, but to those whose lives depended on direction, it was unsettling in the deepest sense. A compass was not merely a tool, it was certainty made visible. And certainty had slipped. In London, a small team of geophysicists at Kew Observatory watched their magnetometers with fascination. The instruments, delicate as harp strings, still recorded gentle waves in the Earth's magnetic field, long after the sky had gone dark and quiet. The storm had left behind a resonance, a kind of echo that refused to fade. The men took turns recording the fluctuations, plotting them carefully on long rolls of paper. At times, the pens drew slow, wide arcs. At others, tiny vibrations that looked almost like a heartbeat. It was as if the planet itself was breathing in its sleep. Across the sea, in New York, engineers in the Coast Survey Office puzzled over similar readings. Their magnetic maps, which guided every ship entering American ports, had shifted overnight. A senior officer, Captain James Melville Gillis, wrote in his log that the variation of the needle appears to have altered by no small amount, and the cause is utterly beyond our present understanding. He was a man of precision, not prone to exaggeration. When he measured the same anomaly 3 days in a row, he realized the change was real. The very idea that the Earth's invisible compass could be bent by a storm from the sun felt like heresy against the clockwork universe that Victorian science still believed in. Merchants complained that ships arrived late. Engineers grumbled that survey lines no longer matched the maps they had drawn the month before. In Canada, a railway foreman discovered that the magnetic bearings of his track no longer aligned with the old survey stakes. He ordered the men to rely on landmarks instead. "The compass has gone mad," one worker wrote in his diary, "and so have the geese in the sky." Even migrating birds seemed confused that season, their formations breaking apart earlier than usual, though few connected the two events. The invisible had touched the living in the offices of the Royal Navy. Quiet concern began to replace curiosity. Navigation was not merely an art, it was empire. The world's sea routes depended on magnetic charts, and if those charts were wrong, fortunes could be lost. Orders were sent to observatories across the colonies, Cape Town, Calcutta, Sydney, to recheck their instruments. The reports that came back were cautious but consistent, slight deviations, unaccountable drifts. A world very slowly righting itself after a blow no one had seen. Meanwhile, the public fascination with the fire in the heavens began to wane. Newspapers moved on to politics, war, and scandal. Only a few editors continued to print letters from readers describing odd effects of magnetism or strange lights at night. In one small Welsh village, miners swore that their compasses deep underground spun wildly whenever the lamps dimmed. In another, a farmer claimed that his iron weather vane trembled whenever the sun shone too brightly. Scientists dismissed such tales as imagination, but somewhere inside, a small doubt remained. The storm had shown that imagination sometimes came closer to truth than calculation. Carrington read what little he could find. He clipped newspaper accounts and filed them neatly among his papers. He had no laboratory large enough to measure magnetism, but he knew the pattern was connected. The flare he had seen was not a solitary act of violence. It was a thread in a larger web of forces that linked sun and earth in ways humanity was only beginning to glimpse. Yet he wrote nothing speculative. His notes remained dry, factual, restrained. He understood that ideas needed time, just as light needed space to travel. Still, the compasses kept misbehaving. On the Arctic expeditions of the following year, navigators noted strange wandering of the magnetic north. One explorer, still haunted by tales of the aurora, described it in his journal as a trembling of the pole itself. It was not far from the truth. The great magnetic currents that circle the planet had indeed shifted slightly, like water settling after a wave. It would take months before they found equilibrium again. The world, of course, moved on. Trains carried passengers who no longer looked up at the night sky. Factories returned to their rhythm. The telegraph lines, cleaned of soot and repaired, clattered once more with business and gossip. Yet beneath that surface hum, the Earth's compass still wandered by fractions of a degree each day, reminding those who watched closely that calm is only ever temporary. For Carrington, those months became a season of reflection. He spent his evenings in the observatory, charting the slow recovery of the sun's surface. The great dark spot he had drawn had dissolved into smaller fragments. Around it, new ones appeared, faint and harmless. The star seemed peaceful again, but he no longer trusted appearances. Sometimes, when he paused between observations, he would think of the sailors steering by uncertain needles, of the invisible cords of magnetism stretching from sky to sea, of the idea that all of it, the light, the energy, the movement, was part of a single breath. Scientists of his generation liked to imagine the universe as a machine, perfect, predictable, obedient to rules. Carrington's flare had cracked that illusion. The machine could snarl, flare, and twist its gears without warning. For a man of his temperament, calm, deliberate, That realization was quietly shattering. Yet there was comfort in it, too. He once told a colleague that the sun reminded him of the sea. Beautiful, dangerous, and alive as autumn deepened. Reports of the wandering compasses gradually ceased. The earth had steadied itself. Ships sailed true again. Surveyors trusted their bearings, and the world's invisible rhythm settled back into place. The Great Storm became memory, a remarkable event, but safely in the past. Only a handful of scientists kept its data close, knowing that what had happened might happen again. Carrington continued to work in quiet obscurity. His paper on the solar outburst was published the next year in a modest journal, where it drew polite interest but little excitement. Few readers grasped its magnitude, but among those few were the seeds of future discovery. Decades later, when physicists learned to measure the sun's magnetism and the behavior of charged particles, they would realize that Carrington's careful note, 11:18 a.m., bright light lasting 5 minutes, was the first written record of a solar flare in human history, but that knowledge still lay in the future. In 1859, the world returned to its routines. The fire had passed, the compasses had settled, and the night sky looked as it always had. Yet for those who had truly paid attention, something had changed forever. They had seen the invisible thread that connects everything: the sun above, the iron beneath, the heart that beats between them. They knew, even if they could not yet prove it, that the earth lives within the weather of the stars. There are moments in history when discovery hides inside confusion. When a simple act, a man looking through a telescope, a sailor noticing his compass stray, quietly alters the course of understanding. The days after the storm were such a moment. The world thought it was recovering. In truth, it was awakening. The compasses that had lost north for a time had pointed, however briefly, toward a new kind of truth. And if you listen to that story now, as the night grows still, you might imagine the silence of those mornings long ago, the soft tick of instruments in an observatory, the slow creak of a ship turning its sea, the faint pull of a needle trying to find its way. The storm had passed, but the memory of it lingered in the air, like the afterglow of lightning behind the clouds. For weeks, perhaps months, the planet itself carried the echo of that touch. Then, quietly, it forgot. The men who lived through it grew old. Their notebooks yellowed, their instruments rusted. The world built new machines, new ways to measure the invisible. But deep within every compass, in the iron that remembers magnetism, there remained a trace, a whisper of the day the poles trembled and the needles lost their certainty. By the middle of September, the world's wires had cooled, but the people who worked among them had not. The telegraph, once the proud emblem of human ingenuity, had revealed itself to be fragile, alive, in a way no one had expected. The storm had burned through its veins and left behind a kind of nervous tremor, a sense that the very air could no longer be trusted. For weeks afterward, operators across continents worked with a new caution, as if each message might awaken something sleeping within the copper. The telegraph network in 1859 was more than a system of communication. It was a symbol of control. It had made the world smaller, compressed time, bound cities and empires together in lines of electricity. Governments relied on it. Merchants built fortunes from it. Wars were fought and settled by its messages. It was, to its generation, what the internet would one day become: a miracle of speed and connection, the nervous system of a new world. And when it faltered, people realized, perhaps for the first time, that progress itself could be frightened. The American Telegraph Company, the British Electric Telegraph Company, the Continental Networks, all had suffered in the Great Storm. Some lines had melted, others had sparked and burned. Insurance agents walked through the ruins with disbelief, taking notes by hand because the wires could not yet be trusted again. In the offices, clerks cleaned blackened equipment and swept up scraps of scorched paper where messages had caught fire in their spools. Every telegraph room carried the same faint scent: smoke, oil, and the metallic tang of ozone that clung stubbornly to the walls. For a while, the companies tried to hide the extent of the damage. Shareholders were reassured that the interruptions were temporary, that the storm was an anomaly, that such a thing could never happen again. But among the engineers, the story was different. In late-night meetings and quiet letters, they admitted a growing unease. The storm had revealed how powerless they truly were. No human invention could stop the sky from interfering. No amount of insulation or battery power could keep out the invisible waves of energy that came from beyond the clouds. In Washington, the scientific press tried to calm the public. Nature, in its early form, ran essays on terrestrial magnetism and the interaction of solar forces, attempting to give shape to the unknown. But even the calmest words could not erase what the telegraphers themselves had seen. They had watched their instruments glow with an unnatural light. They had felt the pulse of something vast running through their fingertips. For them, science was no longer an idea. It was a presence. Every city had its stories. In Boston, an operator claimed he saw blue flames flickering around the brass screws of his desk. In Chicago, one man swore that the Morse key lifted by itself. In New York, a young clerk described the paper tape that fed through his machine as shining faintly, as if lit from within. People spoke of those moments in whispers, afraid of being laughed at. Yet the details matched too closely to dismiss. The Earth itself had been electrified, and no one knew why. For the first time, the telegraph lines, symbols of control, seemed to belong to the sun instead of man. The proud network that linked continents had been exposed as an accidental instrument in a cosmic symphony. Humanity, which had believed it could command the flow of electricity, discovered that it merely borrowed in London. The directors of the Electric Telegraph Company held a closed meeting. They spoke of acts of God, of how to classify losses that came from the heavens. One suggested building thicker lines. Another proposed using lightning arresters. But no one could design a defense against the unknown. The sun, after all, could not be legislated. When they adjourned, the men walked into the gray afternoon feeling smaller than when they had entered. News traveled slowly in those days. And though the auroras had been seen around the world, few understood that the events were connected. The magnetic storm was global, but human understanding was still provincial. In India, telegraph workers recorded strange shocks in their wires. In Australia, operators noticed static so strong that it drowned out messages. In South Africa, the few instruments that existed clicked erratically for days. These were dismissed as local faults. It would take decades before scientists realized that the entire planet had been struck at once, that the storm had touched every wire and compass from pole to pole. For now, people looked for meaning closer to home. Clergymen wrote sermons about the event, describing the aurora as a warning against human pride. Philosophers debated whether electricity itself was a divine force, a visible thread of creation. Newspapers printed letters from readers who believed the world had entered a new era of celestial communication. One even suggested that the sun had tried to speak to Earth through flashes of electric fire, and that man's machines had accidentally intercepted the message. It sounded absurd, but to a public still trembling from what they had witnessed, it was strangely comforting to believe the chaos had purpose. Yet beneath the wonder, fear crept in. The telegraph had been a promise of certainty, a way to master distance and time. Now it had betrayed that promise. The same wires that carried love letters and stock prices could burst into flame without warning. The same batteries that made the world faster could be overwhelmed by invisible fire. It was not progress itself people feared. It was its fragility. The panic was quiet, polite, but real. Bankers hesitated to invest in new lines. Merchants spoke in lowered voices about solar disturbances. In rural areas, where rumor replaced science, stories grew wilder. Some said the wires had caught fire because of ghosts. Others claimed the aurora had traveled through metal like a spirit, punishing greed. There were even reports of people refusing to ride trains during bright nights, fearing the sky might reach down again through the iron rails. Carrington, meanwhile, observed all this from his quiet corner in Surrey. He read the editorials and the scientific notes, clipping and saving them, always careful to separate speculation from fact. To him, the panic of progress was both fascinating and inevitable. Humanity had glimpsed its own limits. The telegraph, that proud invention, had made man feel almost godlike, until the sun reminded him how small he was. Carrington never said so publicly, but in his notebooks he wrote a single line that revealed his private philosophy. There is no instrument immune to the heavens. While the industrial world fretted over commerce and cost, a few men of science began to think differently. They wondered if what had happened might be studied, predicted, even understood. At Greenwich Observatory, a young astronomer named John Herschel, son of the famous William Herschel, compared records of sunspots with reports of magnetic storms and noticed a faint rhythm. Every 11 years, the sun seemed to grow more restless. The discovery was small at first, fragile like a thought not yet believed, but it would grow into one of the pillars of solar science. From the panic came understanding. But that morning in 1859, the idea was too new to calm anyone. Telegraph companies repaired what they could, governments issued new safety recommendations, and the public slowly turned its attention back to everyday matters. Yet the unease remained, a ghost in the wires. Every time an operator heard a crackle, every time a compass needle wavered, they remembered the night of fire. The storm also reached beyond science and commerce. It touched imagination. Artists painted skies that glowed unnaturally bright. Poets wrote of the earth illuminated from within. In salons and universities, people debated the meaning of electricity itself. Was it a force of nature or of life? Could it, as some dreamers suggested, one day be tamed to light cities, to power machines, even to carry voices across oceans? The questions sounded fantastical, but the telegraph had already proven that the impossible could become ordinary. The fire in the wires was not just a warning. It was a glimpse of what might come to be by the end of the year. The panic of progress had faded into resignation. Humanity had accepted the event as a curiosity, a freak occurrence in the early life of modernity. The telegraph lines multiplied again, thicker and stronger than before. Undersea cables were laid to connect continents. The lessons of the storm were half learned, half forgotten. People reassured themselves that what had happened in 1859 was an accident of nature, unlikely to repeat in their lifetimes. And so the world marched forward, building higher towers, brighter lights, and longer wires, unaware that it was weaving itself ever more tightly into the web of the sun. Carrington continued to watch the skies, quietly, faithfully. His observatory remained a place of stillness amid the noise of an accelerating age. The great storm had given him something few men possessed: perspective. He had seen, with his own eyes, the boundary between knowledge and mystery. It had changed him, though the change was invisible. When he spoke, his voice carried a calm that others mistook for detachment. In truth, it was wonder, the kind that does not shout. Morning after morning, as the season slipped toward October, the sky grew quiet again. The brilliance had drained away. The nights were black once more, and the northern horizon no longer shimmered with the restless glow that had haunted it for weeks. The people who had stayed awake to watch the heavens felt almost bereaved, as if something magnificent had come uninvited, dazzled them, and then vanished before they could understand it. What remained was an emptiness, an odd stillness that seemed to rest upon the world like dew. Ships at sea reported calm skies and predictable stars. The telegraph wires, newly repaired and restrung, hummed with their ordinary chatter. Messages of grain prices, Theater openings and politics replaced the startled telegrams that had filled the lines during the storm. Yet the operators still noticed faint quirks. A single spark when no key was pressed, a whisper of static that did not belong. It was as though the air itself remembered. They spoke of it only when the office was quiet, lowering their voices so the sound of the tapping keys would cover the superstition that in London, Richard Carrington resumed his patient observations. Each day he turned the brass dome of his observatory, the gears creaking softly like the breath of an old companion. The sun looked peaceful again, its face pale and spotless except for a few drifting marks. He noted them carefully, unwilling to believe that something so calm could have produced so much chaos. Sometimes he would stop writing, rest his pen against the paper, and simply stare into the eyepiece, watching the slow movement of light and shadow across the solar disk. It was like listening to silence after thunder. The world's scientists had fallen strangely quiet too. The storm had frightened them in ways that equations could not express. The Royal Society discussed it once, politely, and then turned its attention back to safer topics. The newspapers that had printed wild tales of fire in the sky now preferred scandals and wars. The public, soothed by the return of ordinary nights, let the memory slip away. Only a few men and women kept thinking about it, those who felt, deep down, that the earth had been changed in some invisible way. Carrington was among them. He had spent most of his adult life trying to measure the unmeasurable, time, motion, the slow turning of a planet beneath a star. But now he sensed that measurement was not enough. He had glimpsed something vast and alive, something that ignored every human instrument. On the evenings when clouds rolled in and he could not observe, he would sit by the window with a cup of tea, watching the dim light fade over the fields, and wonder if the sun ever truly rested. The people around him went on with their lives. In the cities, gas lamps were replacing candles. In the countryside, railways cut new paths through farmland. The hum of progress returned, steady and comforting. But occasionally, in some distant village, someone would swear that the sky had flickered green for a heartbeat, or that a compass had twitched without cause. The letters describing these small disturbances often reached Carrington's desk, forwarded by friends who knew of his strange interest. He read them all, filed them neatly, and never replied. What could he say? That the sky sometimes remembers its own anger? The silence of the heavens did not mean peace. It meant recovery. The Earth's magnetic field, though no one yet had the words for it, was still settling, like water in a jar that had been shaken too hard. Invisible currents slid through the air, slowly finding their paths again. High above the clouds, the auroral lights retreated to the poles, faint ribbons seen only by sailors on northern seas. Down below, human life continued, unaware of the quiet repair taking place all around it. Carrington kept his records with the same precision as ever. On some days the drawings came easily. On others, his hands trembled slightly, as if the memory of the flare still lived in his muscles. He rarely spoke of that morning now. When visitors asked about his work, he described sunspots in simple, cautious terms. He never used the word fire. Yet the image of it, the sudden blinding light, the impossible brightness blooming in the center of the sun, stayed behind his eyes. It would visit him sometimes in dreams, not frightening, only vast. He began to think of the storm not as a disaster, but as a conversation. The sun had spoken in its own language, and Earth had answered. The wires that burned, the skies that glowed, the compasses that spun, all of it was communication across emptiness, a message carried by light and magnetism. What the message said, no one knew, but its existence changed everything. The universe, once imagined as a cold clockwork, now seemed alive with unseen voices. The silence that followed became its own kind of wonder. People who had watched the aurora found themselves missing it, even as they had feared it. Farmers in New England wrote that their nights felt darker than before. In Northern Europe, Sailors told one another that the stars seemed dimmer. The human eye, once dazzled, struggled to accept the ordinary again. For a brief moment, all of civilization had looked up together. Now it looked down once more into ledgers and newspapers, into the everyday business of living. Carrington's health began to fade in the years that followed, worn thin by long nights and meticulous labor. But he continued to observe whenever the weather allowed. Each sunrise, he lifted the cover from his telescope as gently as if uncovering a sleeping child. He still loved the star that had frightened him. Love and fear, he had decided, were not opposites but mirrors. The more he studied, the more he understood that stability was an illusion. The sun was never still, and neither was he. The world changed around him. New observatories were built, new instruments invented. Younger astronomers, armed with better lenses and better funding, began to study the sun with mathematical confidence. Some visited Carrington to pay their respects. They spoke to him with the enthusiasm of men certain they would master what he had only glimpsed. He smiled at them, nodded kindly, and said little. They would learn, in time, that mastery and understanding are not the same thing. Outside his window, England grew noisier each year. Railways multiplied, factories breathed smoke into the sky, telegraph poles marched across the fields. The silence that had once followed the storm seemed farther away now, buried beneath the rhythm of machines. Yet sometimes, late at night, when the air was still and the stars were clear, the quiet returned. He could feel it like a pulse beneath his feet, the deep, slow heartbeat of the planet itself. Years passed, and the world slowly folded the memory of the great solar storm into the quieter corners of history. The fires in the sky, the humming wires, the wandering compasses, all became curiosities told in letters, quoted in journals, or recalled by aging telegraphers who had once watched blue sparks leap from their machines. By the 1860s, the event had no official name, no monument, no ceremony to mark its place in time. It lived only in fragments, in Carrington's neat handwriting, in the faded graphs from Kew Observatory, and in the nervous laughter of those who had been there when the sun had forgotten its calm. Yet the earth itself had not forgotten. Deep beneath the soil, in its magnetic heart, the storm had left a trace, an invisible scar, a subtle tremor in the planet's field. Each time the sun rose, that scar turned with the earth, silent but present, a reminder written in magnetism rather than ink. To most people, the world seemed unchanged. But to those who watched carefully, the astronomers, the geologists, the surveyors who measured direction and drift, there were hints that the storm had not truly ended. Compasses still wavered by fractions of a degree. Strange electric whispers moved through the air on certain nights. The earth remembered in ways no one yet understood. By then, Richard Carrington had become an older man. His observatory in Surrey, once the stage of discovery, was quieter now. He still rose before dawn, still cleaned the telescope glass with gentle precision, and still turned his gaze toward the sun each morning. But his hands shook a little more, and his notes had grown shorter. What had once been an adventure of science had turned into a ritual of reflection. Each drawing he made of the solar surface, each dark spot and bright flare, was not just a record, but a conversation with a familiar mystery. The storm had changed him in ways no one could see. He no longer thought of the sun as a distant object, but as a living presence, immense, unpredictable, capable of both creation and destruction. Sometimes, after hours of silent observation, he would sit back from the telescope and close his eyes. Behind his eyelids, he could still see the memory of that flare, a white brilliance so fierce that it seemed to pulse with breath. It had lasted only 5 minutes, yet it had stretched across the years, echoing in every spark, every whisper of static, every flicker of the aurora that danced far to the north. Around him, the world was racing ahead. The telegraph, once a fragile marvel, had become the foundation of global communication. Undersea cables now bound continents together, carrying messages faster than ships could cross oceans. The same energy that had once set wires aflame now carried news of births and wars, business deals and heartbreak. Electricity had become not a threat, but a promise, a tool to light streets, to power machines, to define a century. Yet in the quiet of his observatory, Carrington could not forget how easily the sky had taken control of it all. He would sometimes imagine the sun as a sleeping giant, its temper cooled but never gone. On calm days, its surface appeared spotless, serene. On others, it writhed with dark scars, sunspots, reminders of the deep fires that moved beneath. Each time a new cluster appeared, Carrington's pulse quickened. He remembered what had followed last time. The invisible storm that had reached across 93 million miles to make the world tremble. Would it happen again? Could it? He would never live to find out. But the Earth, patient and slow, would carry the memory forward. In the decades that followed Carrington's death, the world grew noisier. Telegraphs multiplied. Trains thundered through the countryside. Cities burned brighter each year. The electric age had begun, and mankind, confident in its inventions, rarely looked upward anymore. The sun was a given, a constant, a background presence. But sometimes, when the air shimmered strangely or the northern sky glowed without warning, old men would tell their grandchildren of the time when night turned to day. The children would laugh, certain it was only a story. In dusty libraries, Carrington's notebooks waited. His careful sketches, small, disciplined circles filled with black dots and neat annotations, gathered dust on wooden shelves. Few scholars read them. The world was too busy making new machines to study the ghosts of old ones. And yet, one by one, as science advanced, his forgotten drawings began to return to light. By the early 20th century, astronomers had begun to understand what Carrington had seen. They built new observatories, climbed mountains with modern lenses, and turned their instruments to the same star he had drawn by hand. Now they could see its surface in motion, massive arcs of plasma leaping into space, storms 1,000 times larger than Earth itself. They named these eruptions solar flares, and when they searched the oldest records for the first one ever observed, they found his name waiting there, September 1st, 1859. The Carrington Event had taken half a century for the world to realize what he had done, that he had been the first human to witness a conversation between star and planet, between light and magnetism, between the cosmic and the ordinary. What he had seen in that 5-minute burst was the sun exhaling, and the Earth flinching in reply to by then. Technology had grown into the very bones of civilization. Telegraph lines had become telephone wires. Street lamps glowed with electric bulbs. Radio waves crossed oceans. Each pulse of current, each flicker of transmission, depended on invisible stability, the same magnetic field that had once trembled. The Earth's memory had become humanity's foundation, and no one realized how fragile it was. Then, in 1921, the memory stirred again. A new solar storm swept across the sky, weaker than the one of 1859, but still fierce enough to disrupt telegraphs and power lines. For a brief night, operators felt a sense of déjà vu, the faint hum in the wires, the needles that shivered, the flickering lights. They called it the railway storm because it shut down electric trains across parts of Europe. Scientists, remembering Carrington's notes, understood at once what had happened. The sun had spoken again. The Earth had remembered its language. From that moment, his name returned. The quiet man from Surrey, once forgotten, became the father of solar physics. His sketch of the flare was printed in journals, studied in universities, admired for its precision. It was simple, almost childlike, a circle of the sun, a few black spots, 2 bright patches where the explosion had begun. But behind those ink marks lay the whole story of human vulnerability, how the smallest mark of light could change an entire planet as the 20th century unfolded. Scientists learned to watch the sun more closely. They sent instruments into the upper air, then into space itself, to measure the invisible winds that flow from it. They discovered that the solar cycle ebbs and rises like a heartbeat, that storms follow rhythm, that light and magnetism travel hand in hand. They built systems to warn when another great flare might come. Yet even with all that knowledge, one truth remained. The Earth had not forgotten because it could not. The sun's breath is its weather. Its storms are written into the pulse of the planet, in the quiet archives of observatories. Carrington's name endured not as a caution, but as a beginning. His discovery had shown that humanity's inventions were not separate from nature, but part of it. The telegraph lines that once burned had merely completed a circuit older than history, a circuit between a star and the life that depended on it. Sometimes, on nights when the aurora glows faintly over the northern horizon, scientists still speak of 1859. They imagine what it must have been like to stand in that silent light, to see the sky blaze without sound, to feel the ground tremble beneath their feet. They know that if such a storm came today, it would not burn paper or shock operators. It would darken satellites, silence radios, erase data, and plunge cities into night. The wires may be newer, the names may be different, but the principle is the same. The sun has not changed. It has only been waiting, and perhaps that is what it means for the Earth to remember, not fear, but readiness. The world carries in its field the trace of every storm it has survived. Somewhere deep in the planet's molten core, in the swirl of iron and fire that gives it its magnetism, lies the echo of 1859, a rhythm still faintly vibrating, a memory of light turned to sound. If you were to stand on a dark hill on a cold night and look up at the stars, you would see the same sun that Carrington once drew, burning quietly in the black sea of space. You would not hear it, but you would feel its warmth on your face, the hum of energy that links you to everything that lives. And if you listen very carefully, beyond the wind and the heartbeat of the Earth, you might sense a deeper pulse, the echo of that long-ago storm. When the planet first learned that even silence can be electric, time has a way of softening the sharp edges of fear. The further the 19th century drifted from the night the sky caught fire, the gentler the story became in memory. The solar storm that had once startled the world was retold as a curiosity, a pretty spectacle, a paragraph in textbooks between comets and eclipses. People remembered the colors, not the consequences. They spoke of crimson clouds and green curtains of light, but forgot the sparks that had leapt from metal, the instruments that had burned, the brief terror that progress might be undone by the heavens. The warning was still there, written in magnetism and memory, but no one was listening to be why the dawn of the 20th century. The world had wrapped itself in wire and light. The hum of electricity filled every street. Trains ran on power instead of steam. Lamps replaced gas. Telephones carried voices through copper veins that reached from city to city. Humanity had done what it always does after surviving a crisis. It mistook survival for mastery. The sun, that great silent partner in every breath and every heartbeat, was again considered harmless. It rose and set, dependable, domestic. Few remembered that once it had reached across the void and made the Earth itself tremble, that in 1908, when a small observatory in Potsdam recorded a burst of solar activity. The news barely made the back pages of the papers. The scientists noted a flicker on their instruments and moved on. A few radio operators complained of static, but no one drew the connection. The new century had other worries: wars, empires, invention. Yet above them all, the sun continued to pulse and breathe, sending its invisible tides of energy through space. The warnings returned in small ways: faint auroras farther south than expected, strange interference in long-distance communication. But they were treated as curiosities. The human mind, comforted by routine, grows deaf to whispers once it has decided the storm has passed. It was not that people had lost respect for nature. They simply believed they had outgrown its temper. The telegraph lines that once carried sparks had been replaced by cables with insulation thicker than a thumb. The delicate compasses of explorers had given way to the mathematics of navigation. And yet, the laws that govern the heavens had not changed. The same breath of charged particles that had once turned night into day still streamed outward from the sun, striking the invisible shield of Earth's magnetic field and setting it ringing like a bell. Most days the bell rang softly, but sometimes it shuddered. During one of those lesser shudders, in 1921, a handful of engineers rediscovered the past. Their switchboards in New York and Paris suddenly hissed. The gauges leapt. Fuses blew for no reason anyone could see. In the confusion, a few remembered the old reports. Carrington's flare, the telegraph fires, the aurora that had painted the tropics. Newspapers ran cautious headlines. Magnetic storm disturbs communication. But the world had grown too dependent on its own brilliance to stay afraid. Within days the power was restored, the noise forgotten. Once again, the warning faded into history. Somewhere in a quiet drawer of the Royal Astronomical Society, Carrington's drawings waited. The ink had turned brown. The paper smelled faintly of dust and time. To most who handled them, they were relics of a gentler era of science, elegant but outdated. Yet hidden in those neat circles was a lesson that the modern world had yet to learn, that progress without humility is only postponement. The sun had already shown its strength once. It would not need to shout next time. As decades rolled on, humanity reached higher. Radios spoke across oceans, airplanes climbed above clouds, satellites were launched to orbit the very star that once humbled the planet. We called it exploration. But in the quiet of laboratories and control rooms, scientists began to notice unsettling patterns. Instruments aboard the early spacecraft recorded bursts of radiation, invisible waves that rippled through the magnetosphere. The sun, viewed through spaceborne telescopes, no longer looked calm. It was a seething ocean of fire, full of loops and storms larger than worlds. The beauty was undeniable, but so was the threat. A few researchers began to revisit Carrington's records, realizing that his brief flare had been the first human glimpse of something far greater. Space weather. They built models and warnings, wrote careful papers about solar wind and geomagnetic disturbance. But outside the small circle of science, the public heard little. Warnings about invisible storms did not fit easily beside headlines about progress and promise. Even when satellites briefly lost contact in the mid-20th century, the explanation was softened, technical difficulty, not solar interference. To admit that the heavens could still touch the earth was to admit vulnerability, and modernity disliked that word. Yet the sky continued to whisper. In 1958, as humanity watched its first rockets climb, the sun erupted again. The auroras returned, faint but unmistakable, glowing above cities that had forgotten how to look up. People took photographs, called them beautiful, and went back indoors. The warning had become decoration. Carrington's ghost might have smiled at the irony. The same fire that once terrified the world was now admired like art on the ceiling of the sky. Even so, the Earth remembered. Every surge of solar energy that struck its magnetic shield left a trace, a ripple recorded by machines deep underground. Those records, stored in metal cabinets and reels of paper, told a story that few cared to read, a story of rhythm. The sun did not act in chaos. It sang in cycles, its tempests rising and falling every 11 years. Anyone who traced those curves could see that another great storm would come one day. It was not prophecy, only pattern. But patterns are easy to ignore when life is bright and busy. By the late 20th century, electricity was no longer a marvel. It was oxygen. Entire nations breathed through it. The telegraph had become the internet. The cable under the sea had multiplied into a network that wrapped the planet. To imagine all of it silenced by the same invisible hand that once lit the 19th century sky seemed impossible. People assumed that progress was a shield. It was, in truth, a larger target. And then, late in the summer of 1989, the sky flickered again. The northern lights spilled farther south than they had in generations, curling over Canada in crimson waves. Astronomers saw the flare days before, watched the magnetic readings tremble, and sent out warnings. Few listened. When the surge arrived, it swept through the power grids of Quebec and plunged millions into sudden darkness. For 12 hours, the modern world felt a small echo of 1859, the silence of machines, the uneasy beauty of a sky alive with fire. People stepped outside to stare, phones useless, televisions blank. They saw what Carrington had seen, the restless pulse of a star, and for a moment, they understood. Then the lights came back, and the understanding faded. Each generation must rediscover humility on its own terms. The storm of 1859 had been a beginning, not a conclusion. It revealed that humanity lives not beside the universe, but inside it, subject to the same forces that move the tides and ignite the stars. Yet with every new invention, we forget again. The warnings grow softer until they vanish, and then the sky must speak louder. Scientists today still watch the sun, tracing its flares and counting its cycles. They know another storm will come, perhaps tomorrow, perhaps a century from now. They have computers and satellites to measure it, shields to blunt it, and plans to survive it. But deep down, they know what Carrington knew on that September morning long ago. That knowledge is not control. The sun is older than our certainty and stronger than our walls of wire, if you listen now. In the stillness before sleep, you can almost hear it, the faint hum of energy that fills the air, the slow breath of the star that lights our world. It has always been there, patient and steady, waiting for us to remember. When the sky warned us, we called it wonder. When it spoke again, we called it progress. One day it will speak louder, and perhaps then we will finally listen. Until that day, the Earth turns quietly beneath its glowing parent, carrying within its magnetic heart the memory of every storm it has endured. The sky is calm tonight, but calm is not the same as silence. Somewhere above, the sun dreams in fire, and the world sleeps under its breath, deaf to the whisper that says, "I have not finished my song." There is a certain stillness that follows every revelation. The night ends, the fire fades, and the world, blinking, begins to rebuild its certainty. It has happened again and again throughout history. After earthquakes, after wars, after storms. The morning after always feels like a promise that the worst is over. Yet sometimes, that calm is not an ending but an interval. The breath the universe takes before speaking again. When the great storm of 1859 passed into legend, humanity returned to its work with the same stubborn optimism that has always carried it forward. Wires were replaced, cities grew brighter, and each generation inherited a world a little faster, a little louder, a little more dependent on invisible current. The warnings written in light faded to faint pencil marks in forgotten notebooks. People learned to trust the hum of their machines more than the silence of the sky to be why the 21st century, the world glowed like a constellation seen from above. At night, the continents themselves shimmered with light, and the boundary between day and darkness blurred into a thin golden veil. Every heartbeat of civilization was electric, from the satellites circling the planet to the phones glowing in every hand. The same force that had once sparked through telegraph wires now carried thought, language, memory. To be human was to be connected, and connection felt eternal. But deep within that web of brightness, the Earth's old memory still turned. The magnetic field continued its ancient dance, bending and flexing under the breath of the sun astronomers. heirs to Carrington's watchful patience, kept their eyes fixed on that golden surface and its restless scars. They had given names to the invisible: solar wind, coronal mass ejection, geomagnetic storm. They had satellites to measure the pulses and equations to predict them. Yet the lesson remained the same. Control was an illusion written in light. In the spring of 2025, the sun entered another of its restless moods. Small flares, harmless and beautiful, appeared almost daily. Photographs flooded the internet, ribbons of color twisting over Arctic skies, the aurora spreading as far south as Rome and Texas. People called it the dancing sky, unaware that the same beauty was the language of warning. Observatories measured rising energy, data streams filled with spikes and waves, and once again, scientists found themselves whispering Carrington's name when the largest flare erupted. It was barely visible to the naked eye, just a bright flash at the edge of the sun that lasted less than 10 minutes. Spaceborne sensors registered the burst, computers translated it into graphs, and messages traveled instantly through the global network. X-class event detected. The words meant little to most people. They scrolled past the news as casually as weather reports. The morning continued, trains on schedule, markets opening, music playing through wireless headphones. The warning had been heard, but not felt. 48 hours later, the particles arrived. They struck the Earth's magnetic field with the same silent violence that had once made the telegraph lines glow. The field bent and shuddered. Compasses twisted. High above, satellites flickered as if in disbelief. In some places, the sky turned pale green at noon. In others, the night horizon pulsed red like distant fire. Power grids strained. Cities blinked. For the first time in generations, people looked up. In that strange twilight, memories awakened. Old news articles about 1859 resurfaced. Forgotten diagrams of Carrington's flare spread across screens powered by failing batteries. Scientists spoke on radio networks that faltered between bursts of static. They repeated the same truth that Carrington had discovered with a telescope and ink. The sun was not constant. It never had been. And every spark we called progress was only borrowed from its fire. The storm that year was smaller than the one that had terrified the Victorian world, yet its reach was far greater. What had once set telegraph keys ablaze now rippled through digital clouds, through servers and satellites, through the invisible lattice that held modern life together. Planes changed course. Satellites switched to safe mode. Some cities lost power for an hour or two. Nothing catastrophic, just enough to remind humanity that it still lived within the weather of a star. And when the currents finally settled, when the lights returned, the planet exhaled a collective breath of relief, the same breath it had taken in 1859 that afterward came the calm. Engineers wrote reports. Scientists refined their models. Governments promised new protections. And soon, as always, the memory began to fade. The sky had warned us again, and again we promised to listen. But listening is hard when the world is bright and busy. We fill the silence with sound, and the whisper of the sun becomes only background noise. Yet for those who stay awake at the quiet edges of night, the memory remains. Somewhere in the hum of a power line or the flicker of a radio signal, they hear the echo of that ancient storm. The earth itself seems to remember, the faint magnetic tremor that runs through rock and ocean, the soft vibration felt by instruments buried deep underground. The planet carries the song of its parent star, and every so often, that song swells loud enough to be heard. If Richard Carrington could see the world now, he would recognize the pattern. He would see the same faith in progress, the same astonishment when the sky interrupts it, and perhaps the same quiet acceptance afterward. He might smile at the satellites tracing circles through the darkness, tiny observatories orbiting where his telescope once pointed. He would know that all of them, from the simplest wire to the grandest machine, still depend on the same fragile calm between storms. and he might wonder what kind of story the next generation will tell. Will they remember the colors or the cause, the beauty or the warning? Will they think of the sun as friend or teacher or both? Perhaps, somewhere, a child will look up at an aurora and feel what Carrington felt, awe first, and then understanding that the light is not magic but message. Every century leaves behind its reminder. The Victorians had their telegraph fires. The modern world has its flickering screens. Each spark tells the same story in a different language. We live in the glow of a star, and the price of that light is attention. When we stop paying it, the universe has its own ways of waking us. And so the morning after the future looks much like the mornings that came before. The sun rises, golden and gentle, over cities still humming, over oceans still gleaming, over fields that forget the storms of centuries past. People stretch, open their windows, and begin again, unaware that the light touching their faces has crossed the same 93 million miles that once carried a warning. It arrives without sound, without mercy, without memory, except the memory the earth keeps for us. Perhaps that is the secret comfort of history. We do not need to remember everything ourselves. The world remembers for us. The magnet in a compass needle, the faint shimmer in a polar sky, the steady pulse of current in a wire. All of them are fragments of the same conversation begun long before we were born. We are surrounded by reminders, soft and constant, waiting for us to notice. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, imagine that conversation continuing. The earth turns beneath you, carrying its silent archive of storms. Above, the sun glows, serene but never still. Between them stretches the quiet space where light travels, a bridge made of memory and motion. On that bridge, the story moves endlessly. Flare, silence, awakening, forgetfulness, and flare again. The pattern does not end. It only waits. And when the next morning comes, whether 100 days from now or 100 years, someone will wake to a strange glow on the horizon, and another story will begin. The instruments will tremble, the sky will speak, and the world will remember, just for a moment, that it is part of something vast and alive. Then, as always, the silence will return, gentle and complete. The sun will shine as if nothing happened. The earth will turn beneath its warmth. And somewhere, in a small observatory or a quiet room, someone will write down the time, the brightness, the color, the same notes Carrington once wrote, because that is what we do when the universe calls. And so, our journey through the night the sun disappeared comes to an end. If you enjoyed this story, leave a comment. Tell me what part of history you'd like to fall asleep to next. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe. It helps more dreamers find their way here. Thank you for listening, and good night.